You see a Joe Tompkins, French drumming expert. Mr. Tompkins holds a Bachelor of Music with Performance Certificate from Eastman School of Music and a Master's in Music from Orchestral Performance from the Manhattan School of Music. He currently is head of the percussion department at Rutgers and the faculty of the percussion department at Mainz. And Mr. Tompkins will give a brief history of French drumming, demonstrating traditional works from the French Regimental Guard and French-American drumming combinations. So, without any further ado, we present Mr. Joe Tompkins.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks to Dave Smith for inviting me to this conference. I drove over from New York this morning, and I'm driving back at 9:30. But it's great to be here. I presented some of this material at the Percussive Arts Society Convention in Indianapolis in November, and we'd basically like to talk about the same things, but in a condensed version, 20 minutes. About 15 years ago, I was introduced to French rudimental drumming, French regimental drumming, through my friend Mark Timolakis, who's the principal percussionist at the Cleveland Orchestra. And we were playing in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania with the Harrisburg Symphony. And over a weekend, we had nothing to do, and I said, do you have a book I can practice from? You know, I was trying to practice on a pad in my hotel room. And he showed me this book, which is called Superior Technique for the Drum by Guy Lefebvre, who was in the French Regimental Guard in Paris. And I had never seen the book, and I was sort of flipping through it and came across a lot of very interesting ideas and interesting rhythmic applications that I hadn't considered. This was a while back, so this is about 15 years ago. And I wanted to briefly discuss a few of those unique ideas and how it inspired me to maybe compose a few pieces that combine French and American drumming concepts. They work very well together because many of the French ideas are so unique and different that when you pair them with American rudiments, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. It just works together. I don't know why. But you have a handout on your table, and I wanted to just sort of go down this list. The first rudiment that is quite different than anything we really have in our standard American set is what the French call the coup de charge, or the charge stroke. And we've sort of appropriated that through in DCI. It's called the mouth. It's an inverted flam. But the French use it differently, and they use it rhythmically. And this is the first line, which says charge stroke triplet. The open circle stands for the right hand. The closed dark circle is the left hand. And essentially, the grace note is accented. So it ends up sounding something like this. But it's more of a rhythm charge stroke, and that was something that caught my eye when I was looking at the Lefebvre book. So it's just a little bit before the beat. Provides this sort of a syncopation. What I've got below that particular passage is Lefebvre's use of the charge stroke in a piece that he wrote in a book called Progressive Etudes for Snare Drum. He has 2 volumes. The second volume is particularly interesting if you want to check it out. Lefebvre was a drum set player as well as a marching drummer. And so he's placed the hi-hat on the offbeats here. I'm going to play the bass drum on the downbeats to keep it a little simpler. But you can see how he applies the charge stroke, or these inverted flams, in his piece. So this is an excerpt from Progressive Etudes, and this is number 2. He's splitting the figures a lot. Sometimes he'll split it with a bar line. 7-lits and 5-lits. A lot of different combinations, things that we don't see in the standard American rudiments. And 7s and 5s are fairly common in French writing, going back to the 1900s, the early part of the 20th century. With the French Regimental Guard. So a lot of interesting things. Lefebvre kind of taps into them in a more modern way. So if you flip the page, you'll see that there are a few excerpts here. Embedded rhythms is one thing that is very common in French writing. And by that I just mean you have faster rhythms inside, for example, a quintuplet. So if you have a 5-lit, it might have 30-second notes inside it, which provides a little bit of extra energy in the figure. So a normal 5-lit would just sound, and that's not uncommon in French writing, but often they would add 30-second notes. This gives it an extra energy, and I found that to be really interesting. So I've applied that. I've written 2 books combining French and American ideas. And in the first volume, the excerpt here is from solo number 3. So you can see the 5-lits just have 30-second notes in them, which is not atypical for French writing. In the solo that I started with, which is number 9 from the second volume of French American Rudimental Solos, this is the application of the charge stroke that I've sort of settled on. And you can see you can use the charge stroke in some pretty adventurous ways. In this case, it's a triplet figure that has the charge stroke inside it. Right? If you apply the charge stroke, then it just makes the triplet seem more syncopated. It's a little bit Elvin Jones, and it gives it a slightly different sense of adventure. And then lastly, I've tried to apply French rudiments in multiple percussion settings. So I've written a few pieces that use different timbres and different drums. And if anybody knows Edgar Perez's work, Ionization, which is one of the first pieces for a percussion ensemble, I wrote a multiple percussion piece that utilizes sort of the same timbres from that work, and then applies French rudiments, but it centers around the opening snare drum motive from that work, which is a particular rhythmic motive that the piece builds on. And the last excerpt here is applied in sort of a multiple percussion setting. So I'd like to play a little bit more, and the next piece that I'm going to play is somewhat similar to the Progressive Etudes, and it's the similar adventurous kind of rhythmic vocabulary. And then I thought maybe we could just talk. If you wanted to ask a few questions, be happy to chat. So this is solo number 8 from the second volume of French American solos. My perception of French drumming is that it has a certain lift to it. I think it's mainly because it's not familiar to my ear. And I would guess it's not familiar to your ear unless you've lived in Paris or something. And so when you place that in a composition next to something that you are familiar with, it provides this nice sort of yin-yang back and forth. And what I found was if you ladle it on too much, then it's not effective. But if you put it next to something that's familiar to us, then you can actually, your ear can kind of decipher what it is. So when I've been writing these pieces, for example, I'll turn off the snares to save your ears, but if I were trying something a little bit on the crazy side, I would put it next to something that we know. So the 5-lip might be next to a paradiddle. So there's just a moment where your ear's like, oh, I can reference this new material and put it into some kind of context. But I'd like to know, I mean, I know that you're all rudimental drumming experts, so I'd like to kind of get your perspective on what you hear with this music, and if you have any thoughts or ideas about it. I know Jeff knows about it, we've talked about it for a little while.
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts. Joe came to West Point a few years back, and we did a master class, and I played one of the pieces, and I approached it just as the notes on the page, very orchestral and legit, a little bit stiff and very precise. And then when he came and played for us, it was very lilted and swingy and groovy, and I was like, oh, that's the way, and it just relaxed everything. So I interpret it more as there's a constant lilt with little bursts of energies that give it a current. But I approached it the wrong way at first, very legit and sterile, but it's a groove.
It's very confusing when you look at the music on the page, which I think is similar with a lot of music. I think it's possible for what is on the page to lock it down. And there's a lot of information. And I think that was my process as well. When I was learning the particular words or in the vocabulary from Lefebvre's book, it really took a long time for me to find the lilt.
Yeah, I think I had approached it through the lens of like Taylor Cluse, like very precise and rigid and a little uptight, but it wasn't like that at all.
Right, it's not like that at all, and that's interesting. If you know who Jacques Taylor Cluse is, he's a famous classical percussionist that lived in Paris, and he wrote a number of snare drum solos that are considered to be the mainstream classical pieces, like Deux Etudes. The interesting thing is when you talk to classical Parisian or French percussionists, they don't really know anything about this because their background is casse claire, which is the pure drum, or the clear drums. it's an orchestral drum, they don't have the same kind of connections that we have between rudimental drumming and orchestral drumming. So they're actually completely separate things. So Lefebvre is, in their mind, sort of a guy who just eats weird stuff off on the side. So there's not a blend like there is in the States between orchestral playing and rudimental playing. I consider rudimental playing to be a foundation, you know, that we kind of have to build on in order to be a good percussionist overall. For them, it's a separate track. So, yeah, it's really different than a classical approach. There's a little bit of that sort of touch and feel in there, but it's really not deleterious. Yeah.
Just a question for you. I've taken a couple of runs at this and not very successfully, and I would echo what you're saying. It's got its own taxonomy, its own vocabulary. What got you over the hump in terms of being able to think in the paradigm?
I would watch a lot of television and just practice one of the French rudiments while I was watching a 30-minute show. And so to get the charge stroke, I would sit in front of the TV. And just, do what Bob Becker does when he practices tabla, just like watch a movie and play one thing for 2 hours. It took me about 2 years to really sort of get it. And the first volume of solos that I wrote was really more or less a study for me. So to get the charge stroke, I wrote a piece that I was thinking about Pratt and how Pratt's music it's kind of through composed and it just goes. It's almost like, there are not a lot of points where there's space. And so I said, well, could I do that and maybe, for example, use the charge stroke? So I came up with something that sounded kind of like. To learn the charge stroke while I was working on that piece that I was writing. So the first volume, each solo, more or less, focused on a specific idea from this book, and that was my way of kind of trying to master the material. It took a long time, and I don't know that I've really mastered it. I think there's a lot of material in here that is, I'd like to try volume 3 and spend some time with some of the new things. There are some very adventurous uses of sevenlets and difficult rhythmic passages in here that I really haven't even tapped into.
Is there a prominent French drummer in this style that we could find, like on YouTube, to watch any references?
I haven't found that. Lefebvre is a little eccentric, I think. When I've talked to people in France, they're like, oh, Lefebvre, yeah, right. He was a member of the, he's sort of like Sandra Moeller might have been. Like he had his own thing going on, and he was like, they thought they respected it. He passed away, unfortunately, a while back, but I've been looking online for trying to find videos. Yeah.
So Vincent Cao, K-A-U, I believe it's called. I believe that's how you spell his last name. He's a French rudimental drummer, more of a traditional rudimental drummer. He just got into the military, and he's kind of leading on drums. He has a lot of YouTube videos. If you look him up or find him on Facebook, Vincent Cao.
C-A-U?
C-K-A-U.
K-A-U.
Yep.
Okay, great. That's good to know. With the videos that I've seen with groups marching, it's like fife and drum, but after too many drinks. I can't figure out what they're doing. It's real loose, and there's a lot of style, but it's almost more like Swiss drumming in a lot of ways. There's a lot of inflection and movement in the. It's not as solid as what we would consider with the drum line. It's hard to decipher when you watch those videos. So, it's an interesting sort of exploration for me, and I appreciate being able to come out here and share it with you. It's a little different, but when I was studying at Manhattan School, Chris Lamb said, I don't want you to bring in a Wilcoxon or a Pratt next time. You have to bring in something new. And I couldn't think of anything, so I just started writing my own music. And for me, this is a sort of a journey, and who knows where it's going to end up, but explore new things.
On these pieces, would they play old traditional grip and master grip?
I think that they play primarily traditional grip from everything that I've seen. And these are sling drums, you know, these are deep drums. So that's all that I've noticed on YouTube. My goal would be to actually go to France and do a sabbatical if I can get time off from my job and spend about 6 months and immerse myself and try to find some people that I can take lessons with and things like that. So far, it's been kind of my own thing, and it'll be interesting to see what their reaction is to the music. You know, mainly I just want to go there to eat, but so yeah.
With some of the notation, I'm not sure. Is it sometimes is the space between notes different with the same notation, or?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So with the charge stroke, you really have a choice. I think once you've got a general sense of how something is working, you can move the space between notes to add energy or inflection. So the charge stroke, I started out, it really kind of sounded like an inverted paradiddle, which is more or less what you're doing. And then you try to get the last note to snug up to the beat. But just like a flam, I can try to make that tighter until it's almost imperceptible that the actual grace note is accented, you know. So you can move things around. They might look the same on the page.
Yeah, because I was figuring that if I was going to do this, how would I notate something that sounds
Right.
different, although it's...
Well, notation is a problem because when I was playing, for example, it took me a while to figure out how to write that down, and I had to consult with friends. And I'm not even sure that it's exactly the way that I hear it in my head, but notation sometimes is very limiting, you know.
Could you play your first charge stroke very, very slowly?
Yeah,
Mark out?
sure. The exercise?
Yes. First one, stop the tape.
Yeah. You know, so really, if I had two drums here, what you're doing is playing continuous triplets. If you look at the figure and say take out all those dark notes, take out the 64th notes, you're playing continuous triplets, but the sticking is this. And then you're just adding. So the triplet is in there, hopefully. And then you're adding a grace note that's accented right before the last triplet, which is it's really hard, right? I mean, to get that to flow. When I started, it's really gimpy. I would wait. And the accent was really hanging me up. And I think that process of watching TV and all that helped me a lot. So, 2 minutes. But that's how I kind of approach it.
In the French book, is there a decoder ring in front of the book? To tell you what the...
No, because I really didn't want to step on their feet that much. I refer people to Lefebvre. I think that this
That's
book...
what I was talking about in the Fed book. Is there
Oh,
one
in this
French?
book. He breaks it down in a very systematic way that's understandable. It's not necessarily a decoder ring at the beginning of the book, but he says if you want to work on charge strokes, there are like 3 or 4 pages where he just focuses on that. And he'll break it down into segments. So 2 or 3 pages might just focus on those 5-lets with the embedded rhythms. It's very logical. And then he actually has etudes at the end of the book that are traditional from the, these go back to the 1800s, but they show traditional applications of these particular rudiments. So it makes a lot of sense, you know, the way that he's got it. I'd highly recommend the book. It's an adventure.
Where is it made?
Steve Weiss. Yeah.
Joe,
Yeah.
just thinking, there's a wonderful old epic movie called Napoleon. It's a silent movie. I think it runs 2, maybe 3 hours. And in one of the scenes, Napoleon is himself greatly disturbed that his corps of drummers
Right.
has,
That's a true story. And then he actually, he created the guard, and he wanted them to be, he wanted it to be a better drumming line.
right.
It's a
And
true
for
story.
function, now, the function, I'm making an assumption here that the charge stroke, in military terms, had a specific purpose and function.
Yeah.
And that, to me, would be the roots of why we do any and all of this.
And it's totally true. These were all military calls, and also there were different levels of elite guards. The elite guards had harder rhythms. They had more complex rhythmic calls.
But so the troops would be able to understand it and
Right.
respond.
Right. And it was a competition between the various levels of the military. If you were in the elite guard, you had a certain very complicated call that meant something on the battlefield. It meant that here come the Marines, you know. So.
Right, that to me would be a very important part
It
of
is.
understanding our roots and our history and where all this came from.
That's a great question. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
From an American rudimental background, I'm really trying to wrap my head around this. Is it fair to say that what you're playing in your first line there is literally what's on the page?
And you mean in the exercise?
Yes.
It's as close as I can get. I want the triplet to be flowing, and I'm interpreting the 32nd note, which is sometimes written as the 64th note. I'm interpreting that as a rhythmic figure rather than a grace note. You know, so I'm not thinking of it as a flam. So I think that there's a little bit of interpretation in terms of the spacing of that accented note. But the
But
triplet,
that accented note is a 32nd note after.
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 yeah, it is. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you.
I think we're done, but if you have any questions or if anybody wants to be in touch, Dave has my email and I'd be happy to chat. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. And as we go on today, I'm going to try to also include who inspired us or who suggested to bring in what clinician. And in this case, it's Dave Smith who brought in Joe Tompkins. So thank you very much, Dave.